3 months ago, a study was published unpacking the details of how we were all dying. The researchers collected data over 4 decades from 22 countries to build one of the most comprehensive databases of death ever assembled, and what they found was genuinely shocking. Young Americans, and in particular young millennials, were facing something of a mass extinction event, which sounds like hyperbole. But compared to the other high-income countries included in the study, an American between the ages of 25 and 44 was more than 2.5 times as likely to die in a given year. So the obvious question is, why? Well, the bad news is that there was no single identifiable cause. And the other bad news is that the array of issues they did find were a pretty comprehensive list of some of the dumbest systems in our current economy. But if this is sounding a bit depressing, don't worry. The bad news is that according to the researchers, a host of recent changes is probably only going to make this worse.
Here's a question for you as you get ready to head out the door potentially. How much sleep did you get last night?
Because of course our healthcare is still in many ways tied to our jobs or it's tied to a marketplace.
It's probably the hardest thing I do all day, so I usually only go up once.
I can't work a 9-to-5 job. Anytime I've ever tried, I started to legitimately lose my mind.
Summit County in Colorado is an affluent town with America's highest life expectancy. Last time reliable data was collected, they had a life expectancy at birth of almost 87 years. On the other end of the spectrum, Oglala Lakota County in South Dakota had a life expectancy at birth of less than 67 years. That is a gap of almost exactly 20 years depending on where you were born in the country. To put that into perspective, that is a bigger gap in life expectancy than the USA collectively and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, literally one of the most impoverished countries on Earth, where healthcare is so lacking that people are still dying of the Black Plague. The common assumption is that the wealthier a group is, the higher their life expectancy will be. But recent generational analysis is now showing that there is another economic factor that might be more important than that. The USA is really rich. And yet our life expectancy is well below other countries with less than half as much income, on paper at least. Now, I know what you are probably thinking. It's clearly because we don't have universal healthcare when all of these other countries do, right? Well, it certainly doesn't help. But most millennials dying in hospitals are doing so in emergency departments, which are required by law to provide stabilizing treatment to anybody regardless of their insurance status or their ability to pay. Sure, you might have crippling debt after you leave, but they will look after anybody. The real problem is that more young people are ending up there in the first place. The good news is that we are not totally alone. We are just at the front of the new trend that is emerging. A different study published by the International Journal of Epidemiology found that people born in English-speaking countries after the 1970s were now at a survival disadvantage. So, if you are less than 45 and speak English, I am sorry to be the one to break this to you. But here are 3 statistical reasons why you probably aren't going to live as long as your parents. The first reason is opportunities and inequality. Now, I know what you are probably thinking. Billionaires may be bad and all, but they didn't pump poor people full of sugar and fat and force them to not exercise for 40 years, right? Well, that's mostly true, and we will get to the role of personal accountability soon, but the data is pretty clear. The higher the inequality, the lower the life expectancy. According to the first study, prior to 1985, America actually had a mortality advantage compared to other high-income countries in the study. This meant that there were about 100,000 people from a similar population sample that were dying in countries like Germany, Canada, France, and Australia that wouldn't have died had they lived here in the USA. This was largely because our healthcare was more advanced and we were experimenting with cutting-edge new treatments before these other countries had caught up. Care was still highly dependent on insurance coverage, but strong unions forced most companies to offer this to workers and their families. But then in the 1980s, something changed which caused union pressure to start to wane at the same time that most other high-income countries caught up. After that, deepening inequality just put us further and further behind. Excess deaths is really just a clinical way of saying deaths that could have been avoided with reasonable interventions. Some of the most common causes of these types of deaths are what are commonly referred to as diseases of despair. Liver disease, overdoses, reckless driving, and overall risky behaviors linked to people who have bleak long-term social and economic prospects. These are all highly prevalent in areas like the Rust Belt that have very few job opportunities and no clear way for people to improve their standard of living. But inequality has been found to work in other less immediately obvious ways as well. The Whitehall studies were conducted on British civil servants of various ranks in the government. It found overwhelmingly that higher-ranking employees were living longer than people in lower-level jobs. The reason was simply stress. People who were aware of their lower organizational standings with less control over what they did on a daily basis had far higher levels of stress than more senior employees who didn't have as many people micromanaging them and could do their work when and how they please, as long as it still got done. The observed increases in cortisol levels of the lower-ranking employees led to significantly higher instances of heart disease, resulting in a life expectancy a full 10 years shorter than their bosses. Tragically, a lot of this difference was from a few people dying quite young. Now, the important thing to remember here is that the elite group in this study were still just people working in jobs as a public servant, and the low-level group had full-time, secure government jobs with benefits. So, if the difference in stress levels between these two groups was enough to knock 10 years off their life expectancy, imagine the difference between an at-will graduate with student loans to pay and someone who doesn't even need to show up to work to get paid. The irony is that, as these pressures are killing young people at increasingly high rates, we are simultaneously raising the alarm that we are running out of young workers. So to fix that problem, we raise pressure on young people. Now, unless something changes, this is likely to only get worse. Millennials are just the first generation this is affecting enough to start getting clearer data on. So it's time to learn how money works to find out how else America got so good at killing young people. This week's video is made possible by Lovable. Lovable is Europe's fastest growing platform that helps you quickly spin up full stack apps by just describing what you need. Whether it's a landing page for your side hustle, a quick dashboard to track a project, or a small tool to automate something tedious, Lovable turns your idea into a working prototype in minutes. I've been using it for those I just need a quick something moments. Stuff that's too small to justify bugging my dev friends, but still worth making. It's fast, simple, and lets me test ideas without slowing anyone else down. And the best part, you stay in control. You can edit, tweak, and expand on what Lovable builds, so it grows alongside your project instead of boxing you in. It's not about replacing teams. It's about giving you a way to tackle those small projects that usually get stuck in backlog limbo, so your ideas don't get lost while you're waiting for resources. Plus, it's surprisingly fun to see your idea take shape in real time. If you've got an idea you want to bring to life without waiting weeks, try Lovable at lovable.dev. There is an anecdote about the life of the millennial generation that goes something like this. In 2005, when they were graduating high school, they were told to go to college or else they would spend their lives flipping burgers. In 2008, when they graduated and couldn't find a job, they were ridiculed for thinking they were too good to get a job flipping burgers until they could land a graduate role. In the early 2010s, people called them greedy for wanting $15 an hour for flipping burgers. And today, people are angry that nobody wants to flip burgers anymore. Now, obviously, this is meant as a joke, but it does demonstrate that career uncertainty and the stress that comes with it have been a constant for millennials throughout their careers. However, this is happening everywhere, including all of the other high-income countries included in this study. In fact, a lot of the European job markets have actually been significantly worse than those here in America, with youth unemployment as high as 20% for years on end. But the difference is in America, this is resulting in higher mortality rates because there is less support for people out of work. Now, I know it might not exactly shock you to learn that these soft Europeans have better welfare systems than ours, but this goes beyond unemployment benefits. Living in America is just really expensive. A result of our high incomes is that regions with actual job opportunities are some of the most expensive places to live in the world. In a lot of these cities, even people with extremely high incomes struggle to make ends meet, which means if they lose their job for whatever reason, they have to find a new one almost immediately or risk serious financial hardship. This can create issues where people who do lose their job have to pick between staying in an expensive city where their chances of finding a new job are higher, or moving to a lower cost of living area where they can survive longer, but it might take them longer to start earning an income again. This obviously still happens in other countries as well, but the gradient is not as extreme, and basic support systems ensure that people aren't literally one bad week away from financial ruin at any given time. Another big factor in this is transport. Now again, I know it's probably not exactly shocking to you that America has a bit of a car centricity problem, but this adds to the mortality problem in a few unexpected ways. The most direct and obvious way is that according to the CDC, America has had the highest crash-related deaths amongst 29 high-income peer countries. We also had the highest rates of pedestrian deaths because our streets are more car-focused and we drive much larger cars than the average in places like Europe. But the biggest difference is that we just drove more. Adjusted for total miles driven, the USA wasn't particularly outstanding in the data, but because we drove so much, deaths on our road were more than twice the average. This also doesn't help with the inequality problem. For a lot of young people who are not financially secure enough to own their own home, their car is their biggest financial purchase, and one that a lot of them can't live without because of a lack of reliable public transportation in their area. car loans are ubiquitous, and one of the biggest stressors on people's finances, which can push them into desperate situations. Cars, inequality, and the threat of imminent financial ruin are certainly not the only variables contributing to our millennial mortality crisis, but most individual factors can be linked back to these three pretty easily. Self-medication, recklessness, chronic illness, accident, stress. These exist everywhere. We just do them a little bit bigger and a little bit better. Now, not only are we dying a lot, but an alarming amount of us who are still left alive are statistically suffering from crippling lifelong impairments. So if this video wasn't depressing enough for you, go and watch this one next to find out how America got so disabled. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.